from the vastness of space, our planet tells countless stories. As we zoom into the continent of Africa, along the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, we arrive in the coastal city of Mombasa, Kenya. Here stands a fortress that has witnessed centuries of struggle, trade, and empire. This is the story of Fort Jesus. Before we dive deeper into the incredible history of Fort Jesus, take a moment to support the channel. If you enjoy learning about history, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's explore the history of Fort Jesus. The Fort Jesus is located in Mombasa City, on the coast of Kenya. One of the three outstanding early Portuguese forts built around the coast of Africa in the 16th century. Fort Jesus is a UNESCO World Heritage Center for its worldwide educational, scientific, and cultural significance. Its main features include strong coral stone walls, large defensive bastions, a dry moat, and a strategic position overlooking the Indian Ocean. The fort also reflects a mix of Portuguese, Arab, and British architectural influences. Main attractions inside the fort include the Fort Jesus Museum with historical artifacts, old cannons used for defense, the Omani House, a Portuguese chapel, prison cells from the colonial period, and an open courtyard where visitors can view the structure and learn about its history. Fort Jesus charges an entry fee to visitors so that they can access and explore the historic site and museum. The entrance fee to visit Fort Jesus varies depending on your residency status. Kenyan citizens typically pay about 200 shillings for adults and 100 shillings for children or students, while East African residents may pay around 400 shillings for adults and 200 shillings for children. For international visitors, the fee is approximately 1,940 shillings for adults and 650 shillings for children. Visitors can reach Fort Jesus using several types of transport. The most common option is a Matatu shared minibus heading to Mombasa Town or Old Town, which usually costs around 50 to 100 shillings, after which visitors walk a short distance to the fort. Travelers can also use taxis or ride-hailing services such as Uber or Bolt for a more comfortable trip, with fares typically ranging from 300 shillings to 600 shillings, depending on distance and traffic. If coming from the Mombasa SGR terminus, the journey to Fort Jesus is about 16 kilometers and takes around 35 to 40 minutes by car. Visitors who want to explore Fort Jesus can find many accommodation options nearby in Mombasa Town. Budget hotels such as Manson Hotel, Sheraton Regency Hotel, and Alizé Palm Tree Hotel are located within about 1 to 2 kilometers of the fort and usually offer affordable rooms starting from around $27, $70 per night, depending on the season and room type. Standing at the entrance of Mombasa's harbor, overlooking the Indian Ocean, lies one of Africa's most historic monuments, Fort Jesus, built in 1593. This fort has witnessed centuries of war, trade, colonization, and cultural exchange. Fort Jesus appears in many old maps and historical records created by Portuguese explorers and cartographers during the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most famous historical maps was drawn by the Portuguese cartographer João, showing the detailed layout of the fort and the surrounding harbor. These maps were used to document and protect the Portuguese trade routes along the East African coast. The construction of Fort Jesus began in 1593 under the orders of the Portuguese King Philip II of Spain to protect Portuguese trade routes along the East African coast in the Indian Ocean. The fort was designed by the Italian military architect Giovanni Battista Cairati and completed in 1596. The fort was built using coral stone and lime mortar, materials commonly found along the Swahili Coast. The structure was designed in the shape of a human figure when viewed from above, symbolizing the body of Christ, which is how the fort got its name. Its thick walls, bastions, and strategic position overlooking the old port of Mombasa made it a powerful defensive fortress meant to control shipping and protect Portuguese interests in the region. Over the centuries, the fort was fought over and controlled by several powers, including the Portuguese, the Omani Arabs, and later, the British, making it one of the most historically significant landmarks on the East African coast. After its construction in 1596, Fort Jesus quickly became one of the most important military and trading strongholds on the East African coast. The Portuguese used the fort to protect their ships and control trade between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. However, the fortress did not remain under Portuguese control for long without conflict. In 1696, forces from the Oman laid siege to the fort in one of the longest sieges in East African history. After nearly 3 years, the Portuguese defenders were defeated in 1698. And the fort came under Omani rule. After Fort Jesus fell to the Omani Empire in 1698, the Omanis took control of Mombasa and the surrounding Swahili Coast. Under Omani rule, the fort was used as a military base and administrative center to strengthen their authority over the region and protect their trade networks across the Indian Ocean. Omanis rebuilt and reinforced parts of the fort that had been damaged during the long siege, and it became an important symbol of their political power along the East African coast. Trade in goods such as ivory, spices, and slaves increased during this period as the Omanis expanded their commercial influence. During the 19th century, the region came under the leadership of Syed Said, who shifted the center of his East African administration to Zanzibar City in 1840. From Zanzibar, he controlled much of the Swahili Coast, including Mombasa. Fort Jesus continued to function as a strategic stronghold, although its military importance gradually declined as political and economic power shifted toward Zanzibar. The fort was occasionally used as a garrison and later as a prison during periods of political unrest. By the late 19th century, European colonial influence increased along the East African coast, and the fort eventually came under the control of the British Empire when Britain established colonial authority in Kenya. The British converted Fort Jesus into a prison, marking another phase in the long history of the fort as a center of power and control in the region. On the 24th of October, 1958, Fort Jesus was officially declared a historical monument by the British colonial government in Kenya. Before this time, the fort had been used as a prison during the colonial period under the British Empire. Recognizing its historical and cultural significance, the colonial government decided to preserve the structure instead of continuing to use it as a correctional facility. As a result, the prisoners were moved elsewhere, and plans were made to restore the fort and transform it into a site for historical preservation. Following its declaration as a monument, the responsibility for managing the site was given to the National Museums of Kenya, which later converted it into a museum. The fort began to house archaeological findings and historical artifacts that reflect the different cultures that had influenced the East African coast, including Portuguese, Arab, Swahili, and British traditions. This transition marked an important step in preserving Kenya's coastal heritage and recognizing Fort Jesus as one of the country's most significant historical landmarks. W.S. March, who donated a number of historical items for public display. These objects included cultural and archaeological materials collected from the coastal region, which helped illustrate the history of the Swahili Coast and the different civilizations that had interacted there over centuries. His donation supported the early development of the museum by providing artifacts that represented the Portuguese, Arab, and local Swahili heritage associated with Fort Jesus and the wider coastal trade networks. The contributions of donors such as W.S. March played an important role in establishing the fort as a center for preserving and displaying the region's historical and cultural heritage. In 2011, Fort Jesus was officially inscribed as a World Heritage by UNESCO. This recognition was given because of the fort's outstanding historical, architectural, and cultural significance. It acknowledged Fort Jesus as one of the best preserved examples of Portuguese military architecture from the 16th century and as an important symbol of the interactions between African, Arab, and European cultures along the East African coast. The designation also recognized the fort's role in illustrating the history of trade and political competition in the Indian Ocean region. Over the centuries, the fort had been controlled by several powers, including the Portuguese Empire, the Omani Empire, and later, the British Empire, making it a significant historical record of cultural exchange and conflict in the region. Being listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site helped strengthen efforts to preserve the monument and promote it as an important cultural heritage site for Kenya and the world. Fort Jesus functions as a national monument and museum that preserves and showcases the history of the East African coast. It is managed by the National Museums of Kenya, which is responsible for its conservation and historical exhibitions. Today, the fort attracts both local and international tourists who visit to learn about the region's past, including the Portuguese, Arab, Swahili, and British influences that shaped the coastal culture. Inside the fort, visitors can explore museum galleries displaying archaeological artifacts, ancient weapons, historical maps, and cultural objects discovered from coastal sites such as Gade and Manda. The site also hosts educational programs, cultural events, and art exhibitions that highlight Kenya's heritage and provide opportunities for artists to display their work to visitors. As a UNESCO World Heritage Site, Fort Jesus is carefully preserved because it represents one of the best preserved examples of Portuguese military architecture and reflects centuries of interaction between African, Arab, Persian, Turkish, and European cultures along the Indian Ocean trade routes. Today, it remains one of the most famous historical landmarks, serving as an important center for tourism, education, and cultural preservation. The Mombasa Butterfly House is a butterfly conservatory located near Fort Jesus. It was established as an ecotourism and conservation center designed to educate visitors about butterflies, biodiversity, and environmental conservation. The facility is built as an enclosed tropical garden where hundreds of butterflies fly freely among flowering plants and shrubs that provide nectar and natural habitats. Visitors walking through the conservatory can observe the life cycle of butterflies from egg, caterpillar, and pupa to adult while learning about their ecological importance. The Butterfly House also plays an important role in conservation and community development. Many of the butterfly pupae displayed in the facility are supplied by local farmers and community groups living near coastal forests. These communities breed butterflies and sell the pupae to the center, creating a sustainable source of income while encouraging the protection of forests and biodiversity. Through this initiative, butterfly farming has helped reduce activities such as tree cutting and has supported conservation efforts in the region. Today, the Mombasa Butterfly House functions as an educational and tourism attraction. Schools, researchers, and tourists visit the center to study butterflies and learn about environmental conservation. The facility also hosts guided tours, educational programs, exhibitions, and community awareness events that promote the importance of protecting pollinators and natural ecosystems. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video.